All right, well, let us look at heroin. And just as a disclaimer before I even get into some of these opioid drugs, I know heroin pretty intimately because I spent a lot of time working heroin dealers, heroin addicts, and watching people use heroin, shoot up heroin, smoke heroin. And so most of my experiences with street drugs, like with opioids, is with heroin. The pills is another phenomenon. I have dealt with some of the pills like the OCs or the oxycodones, Oxycontin, we call them. Some of the other pharmaceuticals, I'm not real knowledgeable or deep in which pharmaceuticals are being used and all that, but I know how they're abused, and I know the main ones with the oxycodone, Oxycontin. So we're going to look at those. But just to let you know, most of what you're going to learn from me in the opioid section is just good old street heroin and how people evolved to it, and then obviously some of the effects. And so I just wanted to put that out there so you don't think I'm not like a pharmacist. And a lot of the pill stuff came out more after I left drug enforcement. That's when pills started really going up in I guess, in use. So anyway, so let's get started here. Let's see how we can work this with me being front and center. Just went and got a workout in, so I'm feeling pretty good. So let's go. Okay, well, there's our slang terms. I just covered them up. So right down here, just to give you an idea here, this is black tar heroin, and this is actually how this was packaged. This is not my photo. I'm not sure if I have photos, but usually when we recover heroin, it's in balloons. And so you have like a piece of plastic, like a corner of a shopping bag, like a grocery bag where it's a plastic bag, and they use the corners and they'll wrap it up and drop it into a balloon. So it's usually not like this when we find it. It's usually in a balloon. So basically you have different colored balloons is what you're seeing. And this paper clip here is just to show the size. So some of the slang terms for heroin: black, tar, chiva. Chiva means goat in Spanish. And goat is slang for heroin in the Spanish language, the Mexican community. Then there's a term called junk or Tootsie Roll. And you can see how, and this is Southwest. That's where all my experiences is with heroin, is the Southwest. The East Coast has powder heroin because it comes from Southeast Asia. What we have, and Southwest Asia, what we have is heroin that comes from Mexico. And so that's why it looks the way it looks. It's kind of a semi-processed form, and that's why they call it black tar. It's not, the process isn't all the way to where it's powderized and where they use it in a powder form. But all that matters is that opioids all have the same effects on the body. Like I mentioned, they're a body drug. They don't mess up the mind with they release chemicals in the brain and all that, but they don't like change perceptions of reality. It's basically a pleasure drug. It's a body drug. And so people take it seeking pleasure, euphoria. Okay, so let us go through here. There we go. So this isn't my photo either, but this is a showing how it's packaged in balloons. And so what's happened now is they're called poly drug dealers. And basically poly drug dealers traffic in a whole bunch of different drugs. You pick up your phone and you call to have drugs delivered to you or to meet somebody to get drugs, and they're selling, and it's Mexican cartel in Phoenix predominantly. They're selling cocaine, powder cocaine. So they're selling crack cocaine, powder cocaine, methamphetamine, sometimes marijuana, it depends, and heroin. And they'll actually use different colored balloons for the different colored drugs. So when I was working career criminals on surveillance, we were following a lot of heroin addicts, and we'd watch them meet with the heroin dealer, and then they would buy the heroin. They'd go park pretty quick and either smoke it or shoot it up. And since we were looking for felony property crimes like burglary, theft, the drug crime didn't really do us any good for putting somebody back in prison. And so we would we just watch them do drugs. Now, if they had kids in the car, we couldn't let them do the drugs and then drive, or smoke drugs. Like, we were following a couple that did a theft and traded the stolen property for money and then bought drugs. And actually, we missed the theft part of it, so they had already had property, but we ended up getting a theft later on them. But either way, they had traded stolen property, got money, bought drugs, went and parked in a parking lot with their 2 kids in the back seat in a car seat, and they started smoking heroin. Well, obviously, the fumes are going in the car. If they're injecting, that's one thing. But the fumes are going in the car, affecting the children. And then also, if they're shooting up and then they were to drive away, we're not going to let them drive knowing that they ingested drugs or took drugs, because the children's safety is at jeopardy. So a lot of times, depending on what our suspects did, we had to change our investigation and what we did, because the safety of people and especially children comes first. But back during that time, and I had just left drug enforcement and I started working these career criminals. It was really hard to let these career criminals buy drugs and watch the drug dealer drive away and not take any enforcement action. So I'll tell you a quick story. We were following this burglar, and he went to a 7-Eleven, and he went to 7-Eleven. He was waiting there, and it was pretty obvious. Like, when you do this long enough and do surveillance for years on drug dealers and drug users, you can tell what's going on. You can pretty much see the pattern. So he went to a 7-Eleven. Not very long after, a car showed up. He got in the car, then he got out. Car left. It was pretty obvious he bought drugs, because why would somebody just get in a car in a parking lot and then get right out? So I said, hey guys, I'm going with the car. Like, that's a straight up heroin deal. I want to see where this guy goes, see if I can get him, maybe stop and get some drugs on him. So I followed him away, and I called a patrol unit. I said, hey, we're following a career criminal. He just probably bought drugs, and can you do a traffic stop on this person? And so the cop pulled him over. Well, the subject had he had an empty plastic bag. So heroin dealers carry their balloons of drugs in a plastic bag usually. And they always have a bottle of water in the front seat. They're ready to just throw all those balloons in their mouth and swallow it with water. So they get rid of the evidence, right? And that's what he did. And so the bag was in there, it was empty. And so for liability reasons, the officer said that, like, we need to transport these 2 guys to the hospital, because if a balloon breaks in them or multiple balloons were to break, and usually they don't, they pass through, but it has happened. My partner had a person that he arrested, a heroin dealer that had ingested a whole bunch of balloons, and they were actually, I don't know how many he swallowed, but anyways, 1 or 2 or enough of them had broke, and I'm not sure how they were packaged, but he overdosed and died in jail. And so that's a problem. And so for liability reasons, you bring him to the hospital, and they give him a product to help flush their system, to get the balloons out of their system. It's called Go Lightly. It's like a saline solution that induces you to have a bowel movement to, I don't know how else to say it right. And it's a gallon jug, and they start drinking it, and you don't go lightly. I don't know where the term go lightly came from, because you don't go lightly. So that's the worst job I ever did, was have to go through human feces pretty much and get balloons out. So those guys, I think one of them had maybe like 10, and the other guy maybe had 5 balloons. I don't remember, but they had balloons in them, in their system. And the one guy was just like sipping, like the driver. You could tell he was the primary dealer. You could tell he was sipping it, and we're like, dude, like, we'll be here all night. You can just sip your drink, but we're going to be here. And his buddy over there is just chugging away, and he flushed his balloons out pretty quick. But the only good thing is usually most of the solids are through by the time, because the balloons are the last thing they consume. So by the time it gets to that, you got balloons to deal with. And I'm not going to get graphic and nasty, but it is nasty. It's just, I don't know how else to say it. But think about it. The heroin dealers, or the drug dealers, the poly-drug dealers, and that will be a quiz question. Poly-drug dealers sell various drugs, and And they'll sell them in balloon format for the most part, just for packaging. So red might be cocaine, blue might be heroin, white might be meth. They have them colored so they know what's in the balloons. But that will be a question, is a polydrug dealer sells various drugs. Thus the term poly. But, so anyways, yeah. Hang on. So if you're a drug dealer and you swallow all your balloons, maybe there's a cop behind you and you think you're going to get stopped and you're a little worried and you throw all those balloons in there and you swallow it. Do you think later on when they pass through your system, you're just going to throw those out? Like hundreds of dollars of drugs? No, absolutely not. They'll actually go through and they'll take them out and sell them. And you're buying a balloon like that is probably not very sanitary and probably biohazard. And it's just a nasty thought. And there's also smugglers, like I mentioned, that come through the airport that come from Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, come from Mexico, and they're called body packers. And what they'll do is and you can look it up, search drugs in condoms, but they'll actually put drugs in a condom, like heroin, cocaine. Usually it's heroin, because heroin is so dense and so expensive for the weight that usually it's heroin, but they do cocaine and whatnot. But they'll swallow condoms containing heroin. And matter of fact, there's a movie called Traffic that was done in Britain. It's like a 6-hour series, kind of like the American Traffic. And that's a movie I recommend. That's pretty close to accurate representation of the whole drug situation in the U.S. But the movie Traffic from Britain had women in there that were swallowing condoms that contained drugs. And then when they would get into, in this case, it was Europe from the Southwest Asia, then they would ingest or take laxatives to basically flush it out, and then they would have the drugs. So that's kind of the nasty real world of drugs, right? It's however you get into a country is how you get into the country. So that's pretty nasty. So going back to the story of the career criminal, right? So we booked these two guys. They were illegal aliens. They were here undocumented, worked for the cartel, had a car registered to somebody that, they didn't know. And they always do that. They register cars to other people, to some apartment complex, an apartment number that it usually exists, but the person doesn't live there. So booked them into jail. They were actually deported. And so we're like a week later, and they had fake ID, like they're set up. It's cartel. Like they have the money to get them fake ID, get them cars, get them everything they need to do their job. So a week later, following the same career criminal, goes to the same 7-Eleven, gets into a car, gets out. I follow the car, get on the radio, say, hey, the career criminal bought dope. Like the week before, a guy that we stopped had heroin. He ended up going to the hospital. We got the heroin flushed out of him, and he was arrested, deported. And so I said, you got to get on these guys like right away, because as soon as they see you, they're going to swallow. So the cop, we're right by a Walgreens, and the cop rolls up and hits his lights. The guy pulled into the Walgreens, and the cop, as soon as he pulled into the Walgreens, the cop was right behind him. Got out, ran up there, and the guy was shoving balloons. Like it was early in the morning, and so like depending on the part of the day or when they restock their drugs, like this dealer had a whole bunch, like a lot of balloons, and so he was just trying to swallow all these balloons with the water, and the cop went up and he's like, stop. He had his taser out, and the guy wouldn't stop, so he actually tased him with the end, not like shot him with the taser, but he pulled it off, and it's like a stun gun, right? So he stunned him, and he said he looked like a Pez dispenser, those little candy things where it's like, doo, 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 doo. He said balloons just started, because a taser shocks you, like you're getting shocked, and so when you shock, your body's, you can't control it. So he's like spitting balloons all over the car. We recovered like 35 balloons, or actually there's that was 35 total. So we recovered some balloons on the floorboard, right? but he had consumed some balloons. So we brought him to the hospital and gave him the go lightly and everything. And it was the same guy that got deported the week before. I mean, so he was already back a week later with a new ID, a new car, had gone all the way back to Mexico and came back in 1 week and was selling for the cartel. Well, he worked for the cartel. And so that's just kind of an idea of when you're dealing with this, there's just a lot of, it's money. It's a business for them. And human resources in Mexico is, there's plenty of people that'll come up here and work for the cartel because they can make a heck of a lot more money than they can doing anything else. So that's just my little heroin story. I might have one more before we close this out. So there's the packaging of it. So most heroin is, it's either smoked or injected. And usually people will start smoking it. I mean, it depends on the person, obviously, but it's called chasing the dragon. So all they do is they burn the heroin and they'll use a straw. So they'll burn it and the fumes, they inhale it, and then they obviously get high from breathing it. And then after a while, when they're breathing it or inhaling it, and it's not having the same effect, then they will start injecting it. And I explained, and that's like a hype kit or a rig, whatever you want to call it. That's what it's called. So the pharmacological effects of heroin. So the acute physical effects usually begin about 15 minutes after injection. So even though you're injecting, it goes straight to the heart and straight to the brain, releases chemicals. The acute effects start kicking in about 15 minutes or so. So they're, and it's a calming, it's a euphoria. And I've seen plenty of people, and you could tell how new a heroin user was or a pill user based on the effect. Like heroin, you build up a tolerance to it. And so at some point you build up such a tolerance that heroin users don't even use heroin to get high anymore. They just take heroin to feel normal. And that's a pretty sad case. And if more people realize heroin makes you feel really good at first, and the pills do. It gives you that euphoria, but eventually you're going to just take it so you don't get sick. And that's how that's what they got to do, is take it so they don't get sick. So you can tell a new user, because the euphoria is just they'll just be sitting there and they're not on the nod necessarily. Well, they are on the nod, but they're just and they're just out of it, man. And you can tell they're really feeling it. And where somebody that's been using it longer, they don't go through that total euphoria. They're just taking it to be normal and to not be sick. And I have a really good video I'll show you after this section here. I'm probably going to have to put a link below this section because I'm going to load it onto another site where hopefully it can't be copied, just because I got to be really careful on what I put out there so it doesn't get copied and put all over the internet. So if it does, I'm coming after you, because anyways, I would hope you wouldn't do that. So the effects of heroin last about 4 to 6 hours, but again, they depend on the dosage and the individual. So a heroin addict, you can pretty much set your clock. I've done surveillance on a lot of them. They usually get rolling around 10, about 10 to noon, depending on the pattern of your person. You can literally set the watch, and okay, they leave between 10 and 11 every day. That's because they usually take their heroin when they get up. So depending on when they get up, 7, 8, or 9 o'clock, they take their heroin. And usually it's the heroin they bought the night before. They live day by day. They don't buy a week's supply of heroin. So they take their heroin when they wake up. That's the heroin they got the night before. Take the heroin, let's say 8 o'clock. Okay, so that means 9, 10, 11, 12. Around 12 or 1, they need their next dose. And they usually don't have it. And this is where you can see where they get really risky. So they take it, they leave between 10 or 11 to go out and do their crimes. Every day, they usually go out and do a crime. A burglary, a theft from a store, retail theft. I've worked a ton of that over the years. They'll steal and then sell it to a pawn shop or sell it to somebody who's got a eBay site. or they'll steal tools from like Home Depot and Lowe's and go trade it in at a pawn shop and get cash. Like every day they live day by day. So they go do their theft around 11, 12, and then as soon as they do their theft, they sell their stolen property. And then they go meet their heroin dealer around 12 or 1, and they buy enough heroin for that, like to take a dose at around noon. Then they buy enough to take another dose around 4, 5 p.m., and then one more before they go to bed. And then they have a dose for the morning. So I interviewed 3 guys. I'm going to just show you the video because they'll tell you how much they use. And between these 3 guys, I guess $260 a day is their habit. I just, a couple years ago, followed a couple from North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, all the way to Kingsport, Tennessee. They were doing retail theft. And their habit between the 2 of them was $250 a day. So that means they have to steal and return, or basically they have to come up with at least $250 a day to support their habit. So it's a crazy habit. So here's some of the effects. The euphoria. That's like the biggest thing is the euphoria. The psychic stimulation. They're going to have track marks if they're injecting. Yeah, they get nausea when they're not taking it. They use it for emotional stabilization. So one thing that's really nasty with opioid drugs is the bowel and bladder suppression. So if you've ever been sick, I don't know if that thing's lit up on me or not. If you've ever been, had diarrhea and you've taken, like most anti-diarrhea medicine is opioid based because it's a bowel suppressor. And so when these people take heroin, they're taking like massive heavy doses and it suppresses their bowel and bladder. So literally they get all blocked up and they can't go to the bathroom. Like it's like, you want to talk about severe constipation. Some individuals I've talked to have actually had to go to the hospital and like surgically get cleaned out, like get enemas. Like, I mean, it's brutal. If you've ever had surgery, any of you out there, have you had surgery and been put on a medicine that's opioid based? If you have, they always give you like stool softeners with it because of the constipation that comes with it. So I had shoulder surgery on this arm right here. And I'm actually due for shoulder surgery on this one just because of 30 plus years of wear and tear, right? So when I had shoulder surgery, they gave me Oxycontin, they gave me Tramadol, and they gave me some 800 milligram aspirin or Tylenol. So like I didn't touch the OCs, the oxycodones, like that freaked me out. Like I've seen too much and I've heard too much about people that just, they had a surgery and they went on pills for the pain and they got addicted. And to no fault of their own. I mean, it's just like it happened. So I took Tramadol, which is a opioid-based drug. And like the worst part of it was, well, I had minor euphoria. Like you have a feeling of well-being. Like you had to sleep sitting up and that's hard to do. So I'm like, okay, well, I need something to help me sleep. So I took it. And I'm like, had a really good feeling of well-being. That's probably the closest I've ever been to being high. Well, it is. I mean, I felt like just really like, I don't care about anything. But the constipation that came with it was like unbearable. I mean, and this is Tramadol. That was like weak compared to harder opioid drugs. So the thing with heroin, like all the drugs we've talked about create primarily psychological addictions. Some of them are a little bit physical, but most of all the drugs out there are psychological, meaning you could stop them and you're just going to psychologically have to deal with it. Opioid-based drugs creates a physical addiction, meaning the body actually becomes dependent on it. And if you shut off the supply to the body gets extremely sick. Like the body has to recover because the body, when it's getting the opioid drugs coming in, basically it's the receptors say, you know what, we're getting all this. We don't need to produce any of our own body's chemicals. And so it doesn't. And so all of a sudden when you stop it, the body's like, hey, whoa, like, hey, we're not ready for this. And so if you've ever heard the term kick in the habit, some of the effects, and I have a video, I'll see if maybe I can play it right here so I don't have to put it down below. Maybe I'll try to do that. But anyways, kick in the habit, like the sweating, the convulsing, like the twitching, the diarrhea, like everything that goes with it. That's where the term kick in the habit came from, is because of the convulsing from coming off heroin. So coming off heroin is really, really bad experience. The thing with heroin is if you could take it once a day, or maybe once every other day, it'd probably be about once every other day, you'd get that same euphoria and all the good feelings of heroin, and you wouldn't get an addiction or you wouldn't build a tolerance to it. The problem is that's people don't take drugs and can just say, okay, I'm just going to take this every other day. I mean, that's pretty rare, because it makes you feel good and you're like, whoa, like I want that. I want that. And then all of a sudden you're to the point of no return. All right. So here's some needle track marks where injections were made actually in the arm. So intravenously, drugs are they're shot up in the vein, right? And so heroin addicts, so they start using up all the veins in their arm. So then they go to their hands or their legs. Sometimes they go under the tongue. Sometimes they go to their private parts. But in your legs, you can almost always find a vein. The problem is your legs are the furthest. There's gravity, and then it's the furthest from your heart. So the circulation isn't very good. So when people end up starting to inject into their legs after they used up their arms, that causes a lot of problems. Because every time you inject in your arm, you create an open sore, and it's got to heal. And here's the bad thing with heroin is it releases histamines, where you get itchy, right? Histamines, like an antihistamine is like in pseudoephedrine or cold medicine so that you don't sneeze. And so, but when you release histamines in your body, you actually get itchy and scratchy. So when I'm watching these people using heroin, like they bought their drugs from their heroin dealer and they're parked and they're doing it, like I can see them with their head down, right? They're either injecting, or sometimes you see them dip down and they're smoking their heroin. And then they come up and they'll put their head back, or they'll just sit there, and then all of a sudden they start rubbing. And usually they rub their nose, where they go like that, and they start rubbing their head. And that's the histamines that are being released in the body from the heroin. And so they'll start scratching and itching. Well, if you have open sores from injecting and then you're itchy, then you're going to have some really bad results. And I'll show you what happens in a second here. Okay, let's see here. Signs and symptoms. Let me just stick myself up here. So here's the physiological effects right here. And then here's the signs and symptoms, right? So it's a muscle relaxant. So your neck relaxes. So that causes nodding, right? And they're just like, I watched two guys in a Barnes & Noble after they had done, actually they didn't do it. I didn't see them do a theft. A lot of times when I follow people, they've already done the crime by the time I found them. And then they sell whatever stolen goods they have, but I can't prove it's stolen. And then they get the money and they buy the drugs. So they had bought their drugs from a heroin dealer, went and sat in a Barnes & Noble. We followed them to a pawn shop, and they went in there and pawned whatever they had stolen before we were on them for surveillance. And these kids, I could tell they were brand new. They were about 18, 19 years old, and you could tell they were just started using heroin, because they're sitting in the Barnes & Noble, and they're just like, heads are like, just like, they're on the nod. Their eyelids were droopy. I tried getting a video of them with my phone, but it was a while ago, and I don't think it turned out very well, but I'm going to have to try to find that one of these days. And then also their face and mouth, like they're relaxing, like they'll literally start drooling, right? I think the one kid might have started drooling. He's just sitting there out. You're just feeling the effects of euphoria. And the larynx gets relaxed, so they have slurred or slowed speech. Their extremities are relaxed. Like it's a relaxant. It's a muscle relaxant. So they have a slow gait. And then the histamines I talked about with the itching, like that's why you can watch these people and you can just see everything. And people, like humans, are creatures of habit, and a lot of them, like the drug addicts, it might affect them a little bit differently, but the patterns are the same. because the drug affects, like heroin lasts about 4 to 6 hours in a person. So every 4 to 6 hours, a heroin addict has to get their drug. And so, and you can tell, like when they start getting sick, like let's say they're out doing crime and we're following them and they're just not having any luck. Like you can see the anxiety in their face, and they start taking risks then, because like if they don't get their drug, like within the next hour or two, they're going to be extremely sick, and they know it. And so they're like, you can just see the anxiety in their face. And when they do get arrested, like when I arrest a heroin addict, like they'll pretty much tell you whatever you want again to avoid going to jail, because going to jail is the worst experience, man, because they go to jail, and if they're in there for 8, 10, 12, 20 hours, whatever it is, they're not getting their heroin, they're going to be miserable, and they know it. And they'll even tell you, they're like, I'll tell you whatever, just don't book me, man. Don't put me in jail because I'll be so sick. So that's just kind of the way it is. So that's what I was talking about with the injecting the leg. So right here, you can actually see that this is the vein, right? And they used up that vein, or they're using it. And so they basically tapped into all the veins they could find on their leg. And again, the problem is the circulation's poor in your legs because you have gravity from your heart. And so when you keep popping into a vein, eventually that vein will collapse, and that vein is no good anymore. It's like you killed the vein because you punctured that wall so many times it collapsed. So then they find another vein, and then another vein, and another vein. Well, what ends up happening is they start killing all the veins going to their legs and going down to their feet and their toes. And so then they get gangrene because they're not getting circulation, and they end up losing a toe, losing their feet, and then they end up losing their legs. So I'm going to put you to a challenge. When you're driving around someday, depending on what part of the city you're driving down or around, if you ever see some of them transients that are panhandling, they got their signs up, and I feel bad for them too, but I can tell you, because at crack houses, they would come with their cardboard signs like, need food, God bless, whatever. They're either alcoholics or they're drug addicts. So if you're giving them money, like I'll sit at a light and people are giving these guys, and there's a lot of them right now. When you see a 19-year-old kid sitting at a traffic light at an intersection or on an overpass of the freeway, those are heroin addicts, man, like straight up. And I'm just telling you, like the way it is on the street. But if you see one in a wheelchair or one with one leg, typically they're older. They're like 40, 50 years old, and they've lost their leg, one or two legs. Almost guaranteed those are heroin addicts that ended up losing their legs. Because like I told you, a heroin addict can live a long time. If they don't overdose, a heroin addict, it doesn't like affect their brain. Their IQ is whatever it started with. They can think. As soon as the drug's out of their system, they're back to who they were. It's just the body is craving that drug so much because the body is physically dependent on that drug. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Close to my retirement, I was doing surveillance on a career criminal. He was a burglar, and I was over at 35th Avenue, just south of like Indian School. I think it was just south of Indian School and 35th Avenue, and doing surveillance. And this burglar, like we never saw him at his house. Like we were sitting at his house, and I was kind of by a daycare, and there was a convenience store right next to me. And late one night, I see a dude in a wheelchair, wheels into the parking lot of the convenience store, goes up to a payphone, and then he just sits there and waits. And I'm like, this is pretty obvious he ordered drugs. I mean, he's in a wheelchair. You could tell he's homeless. And sure enough, like 10 minutes later, a car rolls into the parking lot. He rolls up to the passenger window. You can see they exchange something in the dark. Car leaves. So I'm thinking, you know what? Like this guy knows this neighborhood. Like he lives in this neighborhood. He's homeless. He probably knows a lot about what's going on. He sees a lot. So I walked up to him. I said, "Hey," I said, What'd you just score?" He goes, "Nothing." I go, "Come on, man." Like, he's like, "I got a dime." I go, "Dime of what?" He goes, "Dime of black." And he goes, "You're not going to take it from me, are you?" And I go, and like you could tell, like he was pretty concerned. Like he's like, man, I don't cause no problems. Like I don't steal nothing. All I do is panhandle all day. He's like, I live in whatever behind some wall at this area. You can go look. But he's like, it took me a lot of time to get this money, and I really need it. And I'm like, all right. So tell you what, I said, do you know this house across the street? He's like, well, not really. I said, you're in this area a lot? He goes, all the time. He's like, I'm here. I'm like, do me a favor. Like, tell me if you ever see a car going in and out of that garage. Tell me if you ever see anybody there, and I won't take your dope. And he's like, okay, yeah, no problem. And like, he wheeled away. But I was talking to him, and I'm like, how long you been using this stuff? He's like, about 30 years. This dude is like almost 50 years old. He's like, I've been using it since I was in my 20s. He both his legs were gone. He goes, I lost both my legs to heroin. And he's like, he said, I'm an addict, man. He's like, I've been an addict my whole life. So like, and you talk to this guy and he's just like squared away. Like his mind is sharp, and like, it's not like talking to a tweaker where they're just whoosh, all over the place, and very respectful and everything. And so that is the only time ever that, and I didn't see it, so I couldn't necessarily like say I didn't do my job, but that's the only time I ever let somebody knowingly that had drugs like walk. But I was like, you know what, this dude's been using for like his whole life. And you could tell he was like, he'd be in a hurting unit if he didn't get his fix that night. So I let him walk with it. So here's some more. And you're probably wondering, did he ever call back? If I ever like leave you hanging in this program, and like, cause again, I bounce all over, man. I'm pretty ADD. I don't follow no script. There's no script in front of me. My PowerPoint is my script. I tell stories when they come to my mind. And like I said, there is no one presentation that's ever been the same. I probably forget some really good stories. I probably, whatever. That's just the way it is. So there's no script here. So if I ever leave you hanging, like put it in the discussion, or put it in the discussion and just say, hey, you were like whatever happened to the dude? Because you're probably wondering, did he ever call me, and did I ever find my burglar? And I was ready to move on, right? So no, I never found my burglar, and he never called me. And I'm like, whatever, no big deal. Maybe he never saw anything. He didn't call me. So if I leave you hanging and you're like, whoa, like what happened? Like, what was the resolution, man? Because like in a classroom, somebody will be like, hey, like what happened? Oh, nothing. So anyways, if I leave you hanging, man, let me know. All right, here's another one. This is where, so the circulation is really bad, right, in the arm, and you can tell it's actually just starting to eat the skin. There's just, circulation is really bad. There's another one where the circulation is just terrible, and those are just like major abscesses. And I'm going to show you a video, and if you saw the Mike the Hype video with the meth, if you didn't, like definitely through these modules, like look at my videos below, because those are videos I show in class. And sometimes I just don't want to record it in this format, because I put these on YouTube and they're pretty much like anybody can download YouTube videos. So I'm putting them on another site that hopefully they're protected, because I have to be careful I don't let this stuff go out. So do me a favor, like don't ever take my stuff and put it out there just because this is what makes my program valuable, is to actually bring real life stories in, and real life pictures. Like these are pictures that I've acquired over the years. So anyways, in the modules, if I have links underneath, like Mike the Hype with the methamphetamine, if that didn't turn your stomach, the video that's down below for this, it's called the Lucy Crew, that'll turn your stomach. So, the only problem is some of these videos, I don't get to preface them with like what was happening or something. You know what? Maybe I will. I'll just do it in another format and load them to other sites. So, okay. And here's another one. Really bad abscess. All right. So I'm going to hang on here for a second. All right. Well, this concludes the heroin section. We're still going to get into the opioid drugs like the pharmaceuticals. So that will be under the pharmaceutical section under the opioids. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and watch the Lucy Crew down below in the link. And I'm going to actually, I'm going to narrate it before just so that you understand it, and then I'll let the video run, because the narration I tried to do for Blow, I have to change the settings and the volume, and so I'll just I will see. Okay, so Lucy Crew, check it out below. See you in a bit.